I have told this story only once before, to my wife on the night she asked me why I wept at Cecily Halcroft's wedding. She is the Duchess of Halcroft now, has been for 6 years, and the sight of her face when she looked at James that morning, the sheer unheld brightness of it, undid me in a way I had not been prepared for. My wife held my hand and pressed it. She did not laugh. She is not a woman who laughs at the things that matter. And when I had composed myself enough to speak, I told her everything. The 7 years and the silence and the solicitor and the letters found by a young clerk in a burning office on a Wednesday evening in April. And the man I had called my closest friend for 20 years standing in a cold doorway with a strongbox in his arms and Cecily Marlowe's whole history pressed against his chest. My wife said I ought to write it down someday. I said perhaps. That was 6 years ago. I am writing it now, and I find that the passage of time has not reduced any of it. If anything, it has made each part more vivid, as things sometimes become when they have been turned over many times in the mind. Not distorted, as one might fear, but clarified, the way sediment settles until the water above it is clear. My name is Edmund Fairley. I have been the Duke of Halcroft's nearest friend since we were 19 and miserable together at Kensington College, where he was already developing the habit of thinking before he spoke, which in that environment took considerable courage, and I was already developing the habit of speaking before I thought, which in that environment got me into the kinds of difficulties that require a contained and careful friend to extract one from. We are nothing alike. He is tall where I am unremarkable in height, possessed of an aristocratic gravity that makes rooms quiet when he enters them, while rooms tend merely to get louder when I enter mine. He chooses his words with a precision that suggests each one has been auditioned, and most have been rejected. I say whatever is in my head and then apologize for it, and then say it again. But friendship chooses its own materials. I do not believe we chose each other so much as recognized in the other something that fit, and that fit has held for 30 years without requiring much maintenance, which is the best kind. His name, the Duke's name, is James Ashworth. He came to the title at 31, when his father died of a chest complaint in the autumn of what I will call the first year, because it is where this particular account must begin. He had already, by that time, been 4 years in love with a woman he had not spoken a single word of love to. He had been observing her with a care so contained and so precisely managed that I was the only person alive who knew about it. And even I only knew because I happened to catch him once, at a ball in Caldenmere, in the spring of the year before her marriage, standing in a group of men discussing something about horses, with his face turned appropriately toward the conversation, and his eyes directed somewhere else entirely, and wearing an expression I had not previously seen on him, and have not seen on many other men since. It was not desire, though desire was in it. It was not admiration, though admiration was also present. I have searched for the right word for it over the years, and the best I have managed is recognition, the expression of a man who has found, in a room full of people occupied with the business of performing versions of themselves, a single person who appears to be simply and entirely present, and the relief of finding such a person is so considerable that his face, for once, gives itself away. The person was Cecily Marlowe. She was the daughter of Mr. George Marlowe, a country solicitor of the village of Ashmore, 40 miles north of London, a man of modest income, respectable family, and what I understand to have been an optimistic relationship with his account books. She had come to the Caldenmere ball because the Caldenmere family had been kind to her father decades earlier and had maintained the connection, and the connection was still warm enough that an invitation had been extended. And she was the sort of woman who accepted invitations her father thought she ought to accept, and then attended them with a quietness that did not impose itself on anyone. She was standing in a corner of the room when I first noticed her. The gown was gray silk, well made but not new, pressed with care. She held a glass of orgeat which she was not drinking. Her chaperones, 2 elderly cousins of the Marlowe family who had accompanied her on the understanding that they would sit near the wall and observe, and she would not wander, were installed in chairs at the far end of the ballroom, and Cecily had not wandered, but had stationed herself in this corner as a reasonable median position between her chaperones and the dancing, visible but not intrusive, waiting with a patience that required no visible effort. I noticed the patience first, then the expression that produced it, which was not resigned or unhappy or socially afraid. It was simply the expression of a person who has made a private accommodation with the present moment, decided to be in it without requiring it to be more than it is. There was something so refreshingly uncomplicated about it that I nearly walked across the room to introduce myself before the better part of my judgment suggested I might be imposing. James got there first, in the only way James ever got anywhere he genuinely wanted to go, by refusing to go at all. He remained on the opposite side of the room with his group of horse-discussing men and did not approach her, did not seek an introduction, did not do any of the things that a man interested in a woman at a ball conventionally does. He kept his face turned toward the conversation and his eyes toward the corner, and the economy and precision of it, the absolute control over the form of his attention, while the fact of the attention was entirely unmistakable, at least to me, was the first indication I had of how seriously he meant it. I watched him not look at her for 3/4 of an hour. In that time, 3 different men drifted toward the corner to seek introductions. She received them with the same composed courtesy she brought to everything, and declined 2 invitations to dance without apparent embarrassment, and accepted a 3rd, which she executed gracefully and without obvious enjoyment, and returned to her corner and resumed her patient observation of the room. She was, I thought, exactly the kind of woman who attends balls without any expectation that balls will produce anything of interest, and is mildly relieved when they confirm this expectation, and is entirely herself throughout. Then her chaperones called her away and she was gone, and I watched James watch the empty corner for another 20 minutes, and then I walked over to him and said, "Tell me her name." I should say something more about the Caldenmere ball itself, because the setting matters to what followed. It was not one of the great London assemblies. It was a country ball, the kind of gathering where the same families have been inviting the same other families for 30 years, and the connections are deep and comfortable and slightly fraying at the edges, and everyone knows the older brothers of the younger brothers and the children of people who have died, and the whole thing runs on a pleasant current of shared history that requires no particular effort and produces no particular surprises. James, who was 2 years into practicing his contained composure at such events, had mastered the surface of them. The easy conversation with the host, the obligatory turn with the daughters of the house, the retreat to the group of men discussing horses or politics or the price of good timber, where he could be present without being required to perform. But beneath the surface, he was someone else entirely that evening. I had been watching him for an hour before I understood what I was seeing, and even then it took another 1/4 hour before I could locate the object of it precisely. He was very good at distributing his attention, moving his head at the right intervals, laughing when others laughed, appearing to contribute to the conversation, while his actual attention was somewhere else entirely, fixed on a point across the room with a stillness I had not previously seen in him. When I finally identified the corner, I stood for some time simply observing the quality of his looking. There was nothing fevered about it, nothing desperate or strained. He watched her the way one watches a fire, drawn by the light of it, warmed by the proximity, not reaching. The men beside him were talking about a disputed boundary on the Caldenmere estate, and he was agreeing or disagreeing or asking a question at the appropriate moments. And across the room, Cecily, Marlowe stood in her gray silk and held her glass of orgeat, and waited with the patience of a woman who has made her peace with waiting. And between them there was a great length of polished floor and 50 people moving through the candlelight, and a considerable history that had not yet happened. There was a moment, somewhere in the 2nd hour of the evening, when she looked up from the woman she had been talking to, and her gaze crossed the room and settled, briefly and without apparent intention, on the group of men near the doors. I do not know whether she saw James. I do not know whether anything in her registered his looking, or whether the crossing of their attentions was simply one of those moments that happen in rooms and mean nothing. But she looked across the room, and he was there, looking back, and the moment lasted perhaps 3 seconds, and then a footman passed between them with a tray of glasses, and the moment was done. James looked at his shoes. I thought, he knows she looked. He knows because a man who watches something that carefully always knows when it briefly looks back, and the knowledge has cost him something. I can see it in the slight and barely perceptible stiffening of his spine. He recovered in less than 30 seconds. He said something to the man on his left. He accepted a glass from the footman. He resumed his position in the conversation with every appearance of a man who has never in his life looked at a woman in a gray dress in a corner, and felt, in the 3 seconds she happened to glance toward him, something close to vertigo. But he had. He looked at me with the expression he reserved for accusations he intended to deny. I beg your pardon. The woman in gray, standing in the corner. She has just left with those two elderly ladies in the direction of the supper room. Tell me her name. A pause, not long, not guilty, simply careful. I do not know her name. You will know her name by Tuesday, I said. You will find it out. He looked at me for a moment. You are insufferable, he said, which from James was warmth. He knew her name by the following Tuesday. I know because he told me in the particular tone of a man producing information as though it were incidental, the tone that means it is not incidental at all. Miss Marlowe, he said. Cecily Marlowe, from Ashmore. Her father is George Marlowe, a country solicitor. The family has a connection to the Caldenmere household from some years back. How do you know that? I made an inquiry. He had not made an inquiry of her, of course. He had made inquiries of a series of people who knew people who knew people, a chain of social information gathering that would have impressed an intelligence officer, and that he deployed with the same systematic indirection he applied to everything else that mattered to him. He spent the next several months learning everything about Cecily Marlowe that could be learned without direct approach. Her father's practice, her mother's family, more substantial before her mother's death, her cousins, their situations, their various prospects, her own quiet presence at county events, described by those who mentioned her at all as pleasant, unremarkable in the visual sense, well-read, and possessed of an unusual steadiness for a woman of her age. The books she preferred, according to whoever had occasion to observe such things. The particular nature of the Caldenmere connection, which turned out to be a matter of her father's legal work for them in a previous generation. A connection that had descended into the warm but loose form of an occasional invitation, maintained out of long habit and genuine goodwill. He learned all of this and did nothing with it for the better part of a year. Not nothing, he was building a picture, the way a careful man builds a picture, adding detail to detail until the shape of a person emerges from the accumulation of particulars. What he was not doing was finding any way to occupy a place in that picture himself. He told me in the first winter after Caldenmere that he had found out about the books. Not just that she read, that was general knowledge, but which ones. The neighbor of a Marlowe cousin had mentioned, in an exchange of letters that had been passed through several hands before reaching someone who mentioned it to someone who found occasion to tell James, that Miss Marlowe had borrowed a set of philosophical essays the previous spring, and had returned them with marginal notes of such pertinence that the lending neighbor had added her own responses in different ink, and the volume now existed as a kind of dialogue. James had described this to me in November, standing at my fireplace with a glass of brandy he was not drinking, his voice entirely even, as though a woman leaving marginal notes of pertinence in a borrowed book of philosophical essays was simply a piece of information, and not a piece of information that had got entirely beneath his guard in the way things are not supposed to get beneath James Ashworth's guard. You are in considerable difficulty, I told him. I am managing it. You are not managing it, you are cataloging it. He looked at the fire. I intend to seek an introduction at the Caldenmere Spring Gathering, he said. He did not seek an introduction at the Caldenmere Spring Gathering. I know this because I was there, and I watched the gathering from start to finish, and at no point did James present himself to either of the Marlowe cousins for the purpose of being connected to Miss Marlowe through any of the natural social pathways the evening offered. He came. He stayed for 2 hours. He stood in the positions that allowed him to observe the corner she had occupied in the previous year, which this year was a different corner, a window seat near the eastern wall, and he observed it with the same careful not-looking he had deployed the year before, and he left at 9 o'clock, and we drove home in the dark, and he said nothing. I did not press him that night. I had begun to understand by then that pressing produced only more careful silence, and that the thing required was not pressure but patience, and that the patience required was not mine but his, and that he was in the process of gathering it. The problem was that gathering patience is very difficult to distinguish from accumulating inertia, and I was not certain which of these was happening. The spring following the Caldenmere ball was when the cost of this first became apparent to me, though I suspect it had been apparent to him rather sooner. We were at a county dinner in late March, perhaps 15 miles from Ashmore, the Caldenmere family again, a larger and less formal gathering than the ball, held partly outdoors with long tables in the newly green gardens and considerable general goodwill from the season and the wine. Cecily was there. She was seated, as these things often arranged themselves for women of her station, in the comfortable and unremarkable middle of the table. Not at the end with the great people, not at the foot with the young ones, but in the middle where no particular attention fell, and where she could, I noted, be exactly as much or as little herself as she chose. She was talking to the woman beside her with a quiet animation I had not seen at the ball, relaxed, I thought, in a way that the formality of the ballroom had not allowed. She was laughing at something. It was a small laugh contained, but it changed her face considerably. James was at the far end of the table, near the host. He could see her from where he sat, and I could see him, and I watched the particular quality of his inattention with the resignation of a man watching something preventable that is not being prevented. After the fish, I arranged to change seats, one of those small social maneuvers that require a plausible excuse and a willing accomplice, both of which I managed, and sat beside him during the meat course. I said quietly, "She is 7 places to your left." The woman in the blue gown talking to Mrs. Hartwell. "If you looked, you could speak to her, if you wanted to look." He said, "I see her." "Yes, I know you see her." He looked at his plate, he looked at the table, he looked briefly and entirely controlled in the direction of the blue gown. Then he returned his attention to his fork. "She looks well," he said. I waited. "She is a guest of the Caldenmere family," he said. "I have no natural avenue of introduction. It would require someone to engineer it, and that would be visible to her, and she seems like a woman who would find that uncomfortable." "She seems," I said, "like a woman who is having a perfectly pleasant dinner and is entirely capable of determining for herself whether she finds an introduction uncomfortable." "She is not made of glass, James." He said nothing. "What you are doing," I said, keeping my voice low and even, "is allowing precision and carefulness to function as a substitute for courage. That is not admirable. It is simply the long way of losing something you do not have to lose." He received this with the expression of a man hearing a truth he has already told himself, and is not entirely certain what to do with now that a second person has confirmed it. He did not walk down the table that evening. He spoke to the man on his right and the woman on his left and ate his dinner with perfect composure. And when the party separated at the end of the evening, he watched Cecily walk to her carriage with her 2 cousins and get in and drive away. And we drove home on the night road in silence, and neither of us said anything about it. That was the spring. By the following autumn, Arthur Keene had made his intentions known to her father. Arthur Keene was a gentleman of moderate estate and considerable surface charm, the kind of man who fills the social middle with such natural ease that social middles organize themselves around him without his appearing to try. He was not wicked. He was not particularly bad. He was what I would describe, with the benefit of everything I know now, as a man whose good qualities lived entirely on the surface of him, visible, accessible, apparently reliable, and whose underlying substance was exactly as thin as the margin of a man who needed his wife's family connections as urgently as he needed her remaining family resources, which were, it turned out, barely sufficient for either purpose. But none of this was visible that autumn. What was visible was that he was attentive to Cecily, that he called on the Marlowes within a fortnight of their first meeting, and that he expressed his intentions to her father with a directness and a confidence that James, in his careful and meticulous accumulation of approaches he was not yet making, had never managed to produce. The news reached James in a letter from me because I happened to be in the same county when it became generally known. I kept the letter simple. "Keene has made an offer to Miss Marlowe. I understand it has been accepted. I thought you ought to know before the general announcement." His reply came 3 days later, shorter than his letters usually were. He thanked me for the information. He said it was a suitable match. He said he intended to send a gift. He said nothing else. I read the letter twice and set it down and thought about how much a man's character is visible in what he does not say, and what it cost him to say only that. I was at Halcroft Hall when the formal announcement arrived, one of those social newsletters that circulate through the well-connected like shared air, and I watched him read it at the breakfast table. He read it twice. Then he set it on the table by his cup and looked out the window at the park. The elms were just coming into leaf. The sky was a pale April blue. "I should congratulate them," he said. James, he is a decent man, a pause, by all accounts. He is a man who moved faster than you did. This was perhaps not my most diplomatic contribution to the morning. James looked at me briefly and returned his attention to the park. She has a settled future, he said. That is the relevant thing. Is it? Yes. I did not argue further. He was not wrong in the narrow sense. She did have a settled future, and the settled future was what her father's declining circumstances had made pressing, and we both knew that narrowness was doing very great work in that sentence. He did not attend the wedding. He sent a gift, silver candlesticks, beautiful, entirely impersonal, and left for his northern estates the week before the ceremony and returned 3 weeks after it. We did not speak of Cecily Marlowe again that year, or the year following, because the habit of not speaking of her was one he had been maintaining for 4 years before the marriage, and simply maintained afterward with the same consistency. His father died that October. James became the 9th Duke of Halcroft at 31, in a black mourning coat in a cold church in the village of Halcroft, and he stood at the head of the receiving line at Halcroft Hall afterward and received the condolences of the county with a composure and steadiness I found almost unbearable to watch. He was 31. He was alone. He had just buried his father and was required to perform the functions of his new position immediately, with no concession to grief, and he was performing them without complaint or visible effort. The only thing that told me the cost of it was the very slight pallor around his eyes and the absolute stillness of his hands. I stayed at Halcroft for a fortnight. On the 3rd day we were walking on the western edge of the park, the long path along the wall where the elms stand in a row, when he said, without preparation, "I want to tell you something." "All right. Cecily Keene." He still used her married name with the particular precision of a man who had apparently decided that the use of her married name was a form of acknowledgement of the reality he was required to live in. "Her husband has lost money, a significant amount. 2 investments failed last winter. They are managing, but according to what I have been told, the margin is uncomfortably thin." I looked at him. "According to what you have been told." He was quiet. "James, how do you know that?" We walked for a while in silence, our boots on the damp path, the elms moving in the October wind. A rook called above the wall. Then he said, "There is a solicitor. His name is Hartley. He has an office in London not far from Keene's bank. He has kept me informed of certain developments in the Keene household over the past 2 years." I stopped walking. He continued. I took several steps to catch him. "You have been watching her," I said. "I have been keeping myself informed of her situation." "James, what you are describing is watching her." He did not agree or disagree. He picked up a fallen stick and threw it for the hound that had been following us, and then resumed walking as though the matter were simply information imparted for completion, and not the admission of a sustained, quiet, deliberate attentiveness he had been maintaining for 2 years without saying a word. "Why?" I said. He walked for another 100 yards before answering. "Because I am not willing to not know," he said at last. "That is the only honest answer I can give you. I was not willing to live in a situation where she might be in difficulty and I might not know, and therefore might not be in a position to do something if something needed doing. That is all." "That is not all," I said. "No," he paused, "but it is the part I can say with full honesty. The rest of it is, I am aware it is not an ordinary thing to have done. I am not deceiving myself about what it is. It is not something I have a right to. She does not know and would not, I think, be comfortable knowing. But I could not, I tried after the marriage to simply stop thinking about her situation. I found I could not do it in the way that produced any peace of mind. This was the alternative. It is the action of a man who has found no other form for something he cannot say," I said carefully, "and is expressing it through the only means available to him, which is practical concern. I think it will become a problem if you do it for another 10 years without ever speaking to her." He said nothing. We walked the rest of the path in silence, and when we turned back toward the house the light was going, and the elms were dark against the pale sky, and James walked beside me with the contained stillness of a man who has said more than he intended, and is satisfied with what he said, and will not say anything further. He continued the arrangement with Hartley. The updates came quarterly, brief, factual, the clinical summary of a man who had decided that the minimum of necessary information was the most he had the right to. He knew when the Keen investments failed again in the second winter. He knew when the Weston Park lease was renegotiated on less favorable terms. He knew when Cecily's father died, 2 years after the marriage, quietly, of old age, and what I suspect was a disappointment he had not been well enough to articulate, and when the small inheritance that might have helped was found to be encumbered by the father's own unresolved debts. He told me these things over the years in the same offhand way, and I received them and said nothing critical, having arrived at the conclusion that criticism was not producing change and silence at least preserved the friendship. But I thought about what he was doing. I thought about it considerably, on the long walks I took at my own house in Berkshire, in the evenings when my wife was reading, and I was supposedly reading, but was in fact sitting with a book open and unread, thinking about James Ashworth in his excellent library at Halcroft Hall, reading quarterly summaries about a woman 40 miles away who did not know he existed in any form relevant to her life. The thing that struck me the more I thought about it was the scale of the faithfulness. Not the romantic faithfulness, I had understood that since Caldenmere, the practical faithfulness, the consistency, the complete absence over 6 years and then 7 of any impulse to let it lapse, any moment of convenience or exhaustion or ordinary human self-interest that said, "Enough, it has been long enough, she is no longer your concern." There was none of that. The updates continued. The care continued. And it continued not as a performance and not as a comfort to himself. I do not think it comforted him at all. I think it made him very unhappy, in the quiet and particular way of a man who chooses his unhappiness because the alternative is worse, but simply because he had decided that she mattered, and that a man who has decided something matters does not stop acting on that decision because time has passed. In the 4th year, Arthur Keen died. A winter fever, quick, severe, without particular warning. He was 38. The letter from Hartley was brief. Mr. Arthur Keen deceased the 14th of January. Mrs. Keen in reduced circumstances, the Weston Park lease expiring in the spring, no immediate family support forthcoming, the household to be dissolved by March. I was at Halcroft when this letter arrived. It was a cold February morning. James read it at the library desk and set it face down on the blotter. "Keen is dead," he said. "I'm sorry," I said, and then carefully, "and Mrs. Keen." "In difficulty, considerable difficulty. The Weston Park lease expires. There is no family support. She will need to make other arrangements." Now I thought, now he will go to her. The obstacle has been removed, not cleanly, not pleasantly, but removed, and the decent thing, the human and civilized thing, is to present himself with appropriate tact, with time allowed for grief, with no expectation of anything except that she should know she has someone. A friend, at the very least, of a kind she does not yet know she has. He did not go. What he did instead was sit down at his writing desk and compose, that same morning, a letter to Hartley. He wrote for perhaps 20 minutes, pausing several times in the way he paused when he was selecting language that needed to be exact. He sealed and addressed the letter and rang for it to be taken, and then he returned to the shared legal matter that had brought me to Halcroft and resumed as though nothing had changed. I said, "What did you write to Hartley?" He told me, instructions for a financial arrangement, a sum to be conveyed to Mrs. Keen through Hartley's office under the description of a charitable trust administered by the firm. No name attached to the source. Sufficient for comfortable rooms and modest household for 12 months, renewable at his discretion. I put down the document I was holding. "You are sending her money anonymously." "Yes, James." "She will not accept it from me directly," he said, with a flatness that told me this was not a hypothesis, but a certainty arrived at through his own precise accounting of who she was. "She has too much pride and too much dignity. She will spend 3 months arguing with herself about whether she has the right to refuse money from a man she barely knows, and then she will refuse it, and then she will be in greater difficulty, and I am not willing to put her through that process when the alternative is simply removing the question of the source. This way she has what she needs, and is under no obligation, and does not have to compose a painful letter declining charity from a man she cannot understand the motives of." "She barely knows you because you have never introduced yourself," I said. "Edmund," he said it quietly but with a finality I recognized. "I know what I have not done. I am aware of what I have not done." The question before me now is what can be done within the constraints of what I am willing to do, and what I am willing to do is make sure she has what she needs. That is all. That is not all, I said. That is part of it. The rest of it is that you are in love with her and have been for 6 years, and you are expressing it in a form so oblique that its object will never be able to receive it, and I am asking you to consider whether that arrangement makes any kind of sense. He looked at me for a moment. He did not agree. He did not disagree. He said, "What she needs right now is not a declaration. What she needs is a secure roof and a reliable income and the time to grieve and settle herself. I can provide the first two. That is what I am doing." The arrangement was made. Hartley administered it from the London office. Palfrey, the young clerk who managed the Ashmore branch, conveyed the payments and answered Mrs. Keene's enquiries with the response that the benefactor had requested anonymity, and that he, Palfrey, was not in a position to provide further information. Cecily, as I eventually learned from her own account, had been suspicious of the trust from the first payment. It was too convenient, too precisely timed, too well tailored to her actual situation to be entirely random. It was not the generous gesture of someone who knew her vaguely and felt generally sorry for her. It was the arrangement of someone who knew her situation with a specificity that implied either significant local intelligence or a closer connection than she could identify from any candidate she could think of. She had made lists. She had run through the possibilities with the systematic thoroughness of a woman who has always been better at organizing a problem than at accepting its unanswerability. None of the candidates satisfied her. The precision of the arrangement kept catching at her. Late at night when the lamp was low and the house on Ashmore Lane was quiet, and she had run out of other things to think about. She accepted it because she had no practical alternative, and because the alternative, pride and refusal and the progressive deterioration of her circumstances, was something she had decided she was not willing to choose. She took rooms in Ashmore, in a decent house on a lane she had walked as a child, and she arranged her life around the income with the same quiet competence she brought to everything. And she took in sewing, which she was very good at, and she became a fixture of the town, respectable, self-sufficient, unremarkable to the world at large, and the subject of perfect precision to a man in a library 40 miles to the south. 3 years passed. I will try to say something about those 3 years, because they are the years that are most easily summarized and most easily misunderstood. They were not years in which nothing happened. They were years in which a woman built a life out of the materials available to her, and another person watched her do it with a precision that never diminished. And the building and the watching proceeded simultaneously without the building person knowing the watching was occurring, which is a strange situation when you set it out plainly, but which produced, over 3 years, something very specific. A woman who knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of, and a man who knew the same thing about her, and had the additional grief of knowing it from a distance. The quarterly reports from Hartley were factual documents. James showed me 2 of them over the course of those 3 years, without explanation, in the way of a man who has grown accustomed to carrying information alone, and occasionally needs to set it down somewhere. The first was from the autumn of the year Keene died, 6 months after the trust was established, when Cecily had taken the rooms on Ashmore Lane and had been there long enough for Palfrey to have some observations to make. It described the household in brief. The rooms comfortable and well-maintained, the local reputation good, the sewing work establishing itself through the recommendation of 2 or 3 satisfied clients to their connections, the income from the trust supplemented modestly by her earnings. She had joined the subscription library. She had attended a lecture on natural philosophy at the Ashmore Assembly Room. She had been invited to tea at the vicarage and appeared to have found a congenial connection there. I read this summary and thought about what it did not say. It did not say whether she was lonely, which she certainly was, in whatever form loneliness takes for a woman of self-sufficiency. Not the acute loneliness of someone unaccustomed to their own company, but the particular variety that consists of understanding that what is absent will not return, and arranging oneself around that absence with as much grace as possible, and discovering that the grace is achievable but costs something every morning. I thought about the vicarage tea and found it quietly significant, not as a cure for anything, but as evidence that she was reaching, in the available direction, for connection. She was not retreating into herself. She was not allowing the circumstances to reduce her to the size of the circumstances. James read the same summary standing at the window at Halcroft, and I watched the very slight movement of his jaw and the absolute stillness of the rest of him. And I said nothing, because there was nothing to say that I had not already said. The second report was from the second year. Cecily had taken on 2 additional sewing clients, both connected through the vicarage, and had produced work that was described as unusually fine. She had been reading. The subscription library records confirmed a breadth and seriousness of taste that I imagined was producing no small amount of quiet surprise in the librarian. She had attended a concert at the Assembly Room and had spoken, afterward, with the visiting performer, a young woman from London, in a conversation that had been observed by Palfrey's wife as appearing to give both parties considerable pleasure. James set this report down on the desk. "She is all right," he said. "Yes," I said. "She is more than all right. She is becoming herself very clearly without any assistance." "Which is admirable and also, I think, the thing you need to sit with." "What do you mean?" "I mean," I said carefully, "that the danger of watching someone from a distance for long enough is that you begin to see the watching as a form of providing. You see her flourishing and you tell yourself, she is well, she is managing, my intervention is working, and all of that is true. But it also allows you to postpone indefinitely the moment when you must decide whether the provision is, on its own, enough, whether you are content to be forever the source of the lamp oil, whether that is a form of love or a form of hiding." He looked at me with the expression he kept for accurate observations he was not yet ready to agree with. "I am not hiding," he said. "James." A pause. "I am deferring," he said. "It is not the same thing." "The difference," I said, "is in the duration." He did not respond, but I noticed in the spring of the following year, the 6th year, that the duration was still extending, and that the deferral had not, in 3 years, produced any movement in the direction of the thing deferred. I confronted him in the 6th year. It was November again, cold trees, gray sky, and we were at dinner at Halcroft Hall with no one else present. I said, across the table with the port between us, "6 years." He looked at me. "She has been a widow for 3 of them. She is in Ashmore alone, living carefully on an income she does not know comes from you. She is 32 years old, and you have not sent her a single word. Not when her husband died, not at any point in 3 years when she is 40 miles from London, not one word." He was looking at the decanter. "I know what you are going to say," he said. "Then say it yourself." He turned the glass. "I have no standing," he said. "I have never been introduced to her, I have never spoken to her. I have watched her from a distance for 6 years, and I am funding her household through an anonymous trust, and I have—" He stopped. "I have known every day that I should speak to her, and every day I have found a reason why this particular day is not the right day. She is in grief. She is settling herself. She seems, according to Hartley's most recent report, to be managing with some competence, and disturbing what is working seems worse than continuing what I have been doing." "What you have been doing," I said, "is protecting her from the knowledge that she matters to someone. That is what you have been doing. You have arranged her life so that she has material security and total emotional invisibility, and I am asking you to consider whether that is the arrangement you want to leave in place until one of you dies." He was quiet. "She thinks herself forgotten," I said. "She has no way to believe otherwise. She accepted the trust because she had to, and she is grateful for it, and I expect she finds it painful in the particular way that anonymous charity is always painful. The inability to refuse it properly, the inability to thank it, the endless wondering about who sent it and what it means. And she has no idea that there is a man in England who thinks of her every single day." He looked at me. "Because that is what you do," I said more quietly. "I have known you for 20 years, James. You think about her every day. You have thought about her every day since Caldenmere. She is 40 miles away in a room above a lane, taking in sewing, and she does not know." He put his hands flat on the table and looked at them. The inventory was running, that very precise and honest accounting of the situation, the obligations, the risks. "The risk," he said at last, "is that she finds what I have done not what you imagine she will find it, but something else. Presumptuous, invasive, a form of management she did not request. Whatever I felt while doing it does not change what it looks like from the outside to a woman who has never asked for my attention." "Then explain what it looks like from the inside," I said. He was quiet for a long time. If she receives it badly, he said, I will have made her situation worse. I will have added to everything she has already managed, the discomfort of knowing she is the object of a private and sustained attention from a man she does not know. I will have given her something to refuse, and the refusing will cost her the income she depends on, because she is too proud to keep accepting money from a man whose interest she has explicitly declined. I will have solved nothing and made everything harder. That is the most carefully reasoned argument for inaction I have ever heard, I said. He almost smiled. I have had a long time to develop it. James, I leaned forward. She is intelligent and she is steady and she has survived things she did not expect to survive. If you tell her the truth, all of it, in the order it happened, she will understand it. She may be angry. She is entitled to be angry. But she will understand it because what you did is, viewed from the inside, an act of faithfulness. You have kept faith with her for 6 years in complete silence and at complete cost to yourself and with no possibility of return. That is not nothing. She will see it. He looked at the table. Perhaps, he said. Not perhaps, certainly, when you find the courage to say it. He did not commit to anything that evening. And then, 7 months later, a fire did what I could not. The fire was at the London offices of Hartley and Associates in the second week of April of the 7th year. No one was hurt. The offices were largely empty by the time the fire established itself, but the archive was substantially destroyed. 2 rooms of stored correspondence were lost entirely. The more recent files, maintained in a fireproof strongbox in the Ashmore branch under young Palfrey's management, were intact. Palfrey had brought the box out himself when the news reached him. But the older London files, 7 years of correspondence relating to the estate matter that had established the Halcroft connection, and all the subsequent material about the Keene account, the trust, the instruction letters, were gone. James received Palfrey's letter at Halcroft on a Thursday morning. He sent for me, and I came within the day, and he handed me the letter in the hall without preamble. Palfrey had written to explain the fire and the loss of the archive. He had also written to say that he had, as a matter of practical necessity, written to Mrs. Keene to inform her that the trust would require reconfirmation by its administrator before the next payment could be authorized, and that the administrator had not yet made contact. I looked up. She is in Ashmore, I said slowly, waiting to find out whether the income she depends on will continue, not knowing who the administrator is, not knowing whether he will appear. Yes, James said. That is an unacceptable situation. I should record something about the evening before we left for Ashmore, because I have thought about it since, and it seems to me significant in ways that are not immediately obvious from the surface of it. We were at dinner at Halcroft, James, myself, and the estate's land agent, who had business to discuss and had been invited to stay for the meal. A kindness James extended routinely, and the agent accepted with the gratitude of a man who knows that dining at Halcroft is genuinely better than dining at home. The conversation was general. The state of the South Field, the question of the new roof on the home farm, the agent's opinion of a neighbor's boundary dispute, and the likely legal outcome. I contributed where I could, and allowed my attention to wander where it would. James was entirely present in the conversation. He had the gift, or the discipline, of being wholly in whatever conversation he was actually in, regardless of what was running beneath it. He asked good questions of the agent. He made a decision about the roof that was both practical and generous. He was, to all appearances, the Duke of Halcroft, attending to the business of being the Duke of Halcroft with complete equanimity. The agent left at 9:30. James and I sat on in the dining room with the port and the remains of the fire and the comfortable silence that falls between people who have been friends for a long time and are in the middle of something large without discussing it directly. After a while he said, "The fire has done what I should have done myself." "What is that?" Forced the question. He turned the glass between his hands. "I have been telling myself for 7 years that the moment had not arrived. That circumstances had not arranged themselves in a way that made it possible. And now circumstances have arranged themselves, by an accident, by a fire, not by anything I did, and the moment is here, and I am going to Ashmore in the morning." "Yes," I said. "I am not certain," he said, "how she will receive it." "I know. The most likely outcome is—" He stopped. He started again. "I have run through the possible outcomes a considerable number of times. There is a version in which she is angry and the anger closes everything. There is a version in which she is not angry but is simply settled at this point in the life she has built and does not want the disruption of a declaration from a man she has never met. There is a version in which she receives it with a kind of exhausted acceptance. Yes, of course, that explains the trust, thank you, good day, and closes the door on it without any particular emotion in either direction. These are the most probable outcomes. And the improbable one, I said. He was quiet for a moment. That she understands it, he said. All of it. The 9 years and the reason for the silence and the form the care took, and that she finds it, he paused. I don't know the right word. I have never been able to find the right word for what I hope she finds in it. Faithful, I said. He looked at the table. Yes, he said, that. We drove north the following morning. James sat across from me and did not speak for the first 40 miles, which was familiar and which I had long since learned to receive as thought rather than discourtesy. He had his hands in his lap and his gaze on the window and the particular quality of his stillness that meant the inventory was running. All the things to be said in the right order, the words auditioned and the inadequate ones rejected, the honest ones retained, the shape of the whole tested against the likelihood of its reception. At the 40-mile mark, he said, I am going to tell her everything, in the order it happened, from Caldenmere. Yes, I said. If she asks me why I didn't speak sooner, and she will ask, I am going to tell her the truth, which is that I was afraid of imposing and allowed that fear to function as a kind of substitute for virtue. That is the honest answer. It is, I agreed. And if she says that is not a good reason. It isn't a good reason, I said. No, he said, it is not. But it is the true one, and I have decided that the true answer is the only one available to me, so. He returned to looking at the window. The road ran north through countryside that was fully into May now, everything green and loud with it, the hedgerows thick and the sky wide and pale, and the whole scene of the kind that ought to produce optimism in a reasonable person, and which, in James, appeared to produce only a deepened and focused calm. Ashmore was a quiet market town with a good church and 2 inns, and a high street of respectable shops. I know, he took the letter back, he looked at it. He said in the voice he used when something large had been decided, I have to go to Ashmore. I looked at his face. It was different from the way it had looked at every other point in 7 years. The face of a man who has been waiting for a reason and has been handed one, and is receiving it with something very close to relief. The door had been opened not by him but by a fire, and he was going through it. I will come with you, I said. He did not say no. We drove north on a Thursday morning in the first week of May, through trees coming into serious leaf and a sky that had not yet decided whether to commit to warmth. James sat across from me and did not speak for the first 40 miles. He was thinking, ordering, preparing himself in the only way he knew how, systematically, honestly, without evasion. When he spoke, it was to observe that the road near Trentham had been repaired. I agreed. We continued in silence. Ashmore was a quiet market town with a good church and 2 inns and a high street of respectable shops. We took rooms at the Better Inn. James sent a note to Palfrey. He sat for considerably longer at the writing table with the second note. I watched him from across the room as he wrote and stopped and held the pen and resumed. And when he finally sealed it, the address was Mrs. Cecily Keene, at number 14 Ashmore Lane. He handed it to the inn's boy. He watched it go. He sat down at the small table in the parlor and set his hands flat on the surface and looked at them. What does it say? I asked. That the administrator of the charitable trust is in Ashmore and would be grateful for the opportunity to call on her to discuss the continuation of the arrangement. That the fire at the London office has disrupted the account and that a meeting is necessary to confirm the arrangements going forward. He paused. That it is signed with my name and title. She will recognize the title, I expect. Yes, she may not be entirely surprised. She is intelligent. I suspect the obvious candidates had not satisfied her, and something with the specificity this arrangement had would eventually resolve to a name she had not immediately considered. Her reply came the following morning. Brief, contained, written in a handwriting that had a precision and steadiness to it, the handwriting of a woman who has learned, through circumstance and character, to be careful with things. She would receive the Duke of Halcroft at 2 o'clock on Friday at number 14 Ashmore Lane if that hour was convenient. She thanked him for his note. No indication of her feelings about it. No warmth, no coldness, no hint of surprise. Simply, I will see you. James read the note twice. He set it on the table. He said, she will see me. She will see you, I confirmed. We went at 2 o'clock. James walked slightly ahead of me on the lane, his pace even, his back straight. His hands at his sides in the controlled looseness I recognized as the physical equivalent of his voice in difficult circumstances. Everything contained, everything precise, nothing wasted. The rooms at number 14 were on the first floor, up a clean staircase with a good banister. The sitting room looked onto the lane through a window that admitted excellent afternoon light. 2 comfortable chairs, a work table with a piece of sewing folded on it, a small bookcase holding more volumes than I expected, a writing table, a vase of spring flowers, something white, something yellow that filled the room with a smell that was modest and persistent. The overall impression was of a woman who had received a particular hand of cards and had played it with skill and care that maintained her own standards within it, without fanfare and without self-pity. Cecily Keene was 32. She was standing when we came in, having risen from the chair by the window, and there was about the way she stood that quality I had noticed when she was 22, that composure, that presence, but different now, changed by experience into something denser and more rooted. The composure not of a young woman waiting with patience, but of a woman who has survived several things she did not expect to survive, and has found, in the surviving, that she knows something about herself she had not previously known. She looked at James, James looked at her. I stood behind him and thought, 10 years. 10 years since Caldenmere, and they have never once spoken directly to each other, and they have been in every way except the most direct in each other's company constantly. Your Grace, she said, precise, contained, giving nothing away until she knew what to give. Mrs. Keene, James said, thank you for agreeing to receive us. She inclined her head. Please sit down. The ritual of arrangement, chairs, the offer of tea, the acceptance, the small woman she had as a servant bringing the tray and departing, gave us all a few minutes to settle. Cecily poured the tea with steady hands. James held his cup without drinking. I drank mine with more haste than the occasion required and tried to take up as little space in the room as possible. James said without preamble in the direct voice he used for things that mattered most. I arranged the charitable trust. There is no trust in the formal sense of a registered charitable body. The money has come directly from me, conveyed through Hartley's firm under that description because I instructed them to describe it that way. I want you to know that. I am sorry I did not tell you sooner. Cecily set down her cup. How long, she said. The steadiness of her voice was its own achievement. 3 years since the trust was established, he said. Since your husband died. She was looking at him with the direct and serious attention she had brought to everything since we came in. The attention of a woman who is listening not merely to what is being said, but to what it means and why and what it changes. And before that, she said, Palfrey told me some of the older correspondence was lost in the fire. Was there older correspondence relating to me? Yes. How much older? He held her gaze. He had decided to tell the truth, and he was going to do it as he did everything, completely. The arrangement with Hartley that produced the connection to your situation was established 6 years before the trust was created. I have had someone informing me of your situation for 9 years in total. The silence that followed had the quality of weight, not the silence of a conversation that has stopped. The silence of a room in which something very large has been placed, and everyone present is still assessing its dimensions. Cecily looked at the table, then at the window. Her hands were folded in her lap with a stillness that was entirely deliberate. 9 years, she said. Yes. You knew about Mr. Keene's investments. I was informed of the failures, yes. You knew when he died. I was informed when he died. You knew about all of this. Her eyes moved briefly to the room around her, the modest furnishings, the work table, the window onto the lane. The rooms, the needlework. The arrangement of things. I have received quarterly summaries from Hartley, not detailed personal information, not what you were thinking or feeling, only the factual circumstances. But yes, in that sense I was informed of your situation throughout. She stood, not abruptly, nothing she did was abrupt, but she rose, went to the window and stood with her back to us looking out at the lane, and I watched James watch her back, and the expression on his face was the expression I had seen on the morning of his father's death. That absolute, costly control. I want to understand something, she said without turning. You have known my situation. You have watched it through a solicitor for 9 years. When my husband died, rather than making any kind of direct contact, you sent money through an intermediary and said nothing. For 3 years, I have lived on that money and had no idea who sent it. And in all of that time, a pause. You did not think at any point that I might benefit from knowing. I thought about it, James said. I thought about it a great deal. And yet, he held very still. I told myself initially that you were in grief and that introducing myself to a recently widowed woman was an imposition I was not willing to make. Later, I told myself that the situation had stabilized and that disturbing what was working would be worse than continuing what I was doing. These reasons are not entirely rational. The underlying reason is that I did not know how to tell you in a way that would not ask something of you that I had no right to ask. She turned from the window. Her face, when I saw it again, was not angry in the simple way I had feared. It was the face of a woman revising a significant portion of what she had understood about her own history, and the revision was large enough that she was doing it carefully, piece by piece, without rushing it. What might you have asked? She said. He looked at her steadily. He had decided to say it, and he was going to say it as he said everything that mattered, completely and without hedging. I would have asked nothing, he said. I would have said what I am saying now. That you have mattered to me since I first saw you in a ballroom in Caldenmere, when you were 22 and I was 27, and I did not know your name and you did not know I existed. That you have continued to matter to me without interruption in all of the time since. That I was aware, in the spring when you became engaged to Mr. Keene, that I had been too careful too long and had missed a moment I should not have missed. That I have thought of that with a regularity that would probably surprise you, and thought of you with a consistency that has not, in 9 years, diminished. And that I am saying it now not because I have any expectation of what you will say in return, but because the alternative, your continuing to live without knowing any of this, seems to me worse than the discomfort of telling you. He stopped. Outside on the lane a cart passed, horses' hooves on stone, the rumble of wheels, and then it was quiet again. Cecily was looking at him. The inspection she was conducting was thorough and unhurried and not unkind. It was the inspection of a person trying to see something as accurately as possible, which requires taking the time to be certain of what she is seeing. I remember you, she said at last. From Caldenmere. From Caldenmere, a brief pause. I did not remember your name, I was not told it, but I remember you were in the room. You were with a group of gentlemen near the doors, and I noticed you because, she stopped. Something private moved in her expression, quickly managed. You looked like a man who had decided not to enjoy himself and was succeeding. The quality of the room changed slightly. James made a sound that was almost a laugh, a single controlled breath, the closest I had ever seen him come to it in a formal context. That is quite accurate, he said. You were watching the room, she said. I was watching a part of it. Which part? He held her gaze. A corner, he said, where a woman in gray silk was waiting with a patience I found remarkable, and a quality of simply being present in a room full of people performing rather elaborate versions of themselves. It was the most restful thing in the room. She was very still. I was not expecting to be noticed. I know that was a good part of it. She sat down again, not in the chair across from him, but on the small settee beside the window, closer than before, in the way of a person who has made an adjustment, private and internal, that has shifted her sense of the appropriate distance between them. You should have spoken to me then, she said. Yes. If you felt, as you say, at that time, you should have asked for an introduction. Yes, I should have. I did not, for a reason that seemed adequate at the time and seems considerably less adequate now. I did not believe that an introduction would be welcome. You seemed, I have thought a great deal about how to explain this, you seemed entirely self-sufficient. Not closed, not cold, but not in need of anything from the room around you, including me, and I did not know how to present myself to a person who did not appear to need presenting to without that being an intrusion. He paused. I have spent a considerable portion of my life failing to put myself forward at the right moment because I am more afraid of imposing than of losing things. I am aware that is not a rational waiting. No, she said, it is not, but her tone was not a judgment. It was the tone of a woman assessing something new, and finding it recognizable in the way that other people's most honest admissions are always recognizable, because they name something she has also felt in her own version. "I should like to be angry," she said. "You are entirely entitled to be. You watched my situation for 9 years. You sent money through a solicitor so that I could not know who sent it and could not refuse it and could not—" A pause. Something moved through her voice on the next words, not bitterness, but the residue of a specific loneliness. "I spent 3 years trying to work out who my benefactor was. I made lists. I had theories. I was grateful and I was baffled and there is a particular feeling," she said slowly, "of being helped by someone you cannot identify, which is different from being helped by someone you know. It is generous, but it is also isolating. You cannot thank them honestly. You cannot refuse them honestly. You do not know what you have accepted or what it means." "I know," James said quietly. "That was wrong of me. The mechanism was wrong. I told myself it was the best I could offer without asking anything in return, and that was true, but it was not the only true thing." "What is the other true thing?" He met her eyes. "That I did not know how to come to you. I did not know how to stand before you and say any of this without it being a claim I had not earned the right to make. And so I did the thing I could do without claiming anything, which was to make sure you were not hungry and not cold and that the lamp had oil. I told myself that was enough. It was not." She looked at him for a long time. The afternoon light came through the window behind her, and she sat in that light with her hands in her lap and her face as still as she had kept it throughout, except for the eyes, which were doing the serious and careful work of understanding something larger and stranger than she had anticipated. 9 years, she said eventually. 9 years. You were there the whole time. Yes. While I believed, she stopped. She looked at the spring flowers in the vase. She said in a voice that was measured and quiet, "I had decided somewhere in the last several years that I had been processed, by circumstances, by everything. I was the solicitor's daughter who made a middling match and was widowed young and took in sewing. I was not someone for whom anything particular was happening. And I was not unhappy, I want to be clear about that. I was not unhappy. But I had reached a conclusion about the scope of my life, and you are telling me the conclusion was wrong, and that is," she paused, selecting the word carefully, "disorienting." "I am sorry," James said. "For the 9 years of silence, I am sorry for all of it. I am not sorry for the underlying. I cannot be sorry for having cared about you, because I have not found a way to stop. But I am sorry for the form it took, and the cost that form had for you." She looked at him. "The underlying," she said quietly. "Yes. Say it again plainly." He was quiet for a moment, preparing it, not avoiding it. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been in love with you since Caldenmere. Everything I have done in the past 9 years that touches your name has come from that. The watching, the trust, the silence, the anonymity, all of it. It is imperfect and it is presumptuous, and I am not asking you to receive it as anything except the truth of what it has been." He paused. "That is what I should have said years ago. I am saying it now." The room was very quiet. Cecily looked at him for a long time. The quality of her stillness had shifted throughout the conversation, each change too small to name individually, but the total effect of them considerable. She was not the woman who had received us 2 hours ago. She was the same woman, but the internal arrangement had changed, the way a room changes when furniture is moved from where it was placed by necessity to where it actually belongs. "I used to think," she said at last, "that the man I had noticed at Caldenmere was someone simply passing through, someone at the edge of things who was not particularly attended to and did not particularly attend." "I attended," James said. "I know that now." She was looking at her hands. "It changes a very great deal, about the past several years specifically." She looked up. "I cannot tell you today what I feel about it. I have not had sufficient time to understand what I feel. It is very large." "I know. But I would like," she paused. "I would like to continue this conversation, not today, over time. I would like to understand it better, the shape of it, what it was like for you." "It was difficult," he said. "And it was necessary. I could not have done otherwise. That is probably not a reassuring thing to say." "It is remarkably reassuring, actually," she said. We stayed another hour. James answered her questions, many, specific, intelligent, delivered with the measured directness she brought to everything. And I drank 3 more cups of tea and tried to occupy as little space as possible. Cecily talked about Ashmore. The 3 years, the rooms, the needlework, the long evenings with the books, and the persistent unanswered question of the anonymous benefactor. She talked with a frankness that surprised me, as though having decided to allow the conversation to happen, she was going to allow it fully. And James listened with complete and still attention, asking real questions, the questions of someone who wants to know accurately and not approximately, and she answered them. Between the questions and answers, there were silences that were comfortable in the way that silences between people are only comfortable when both have decided, without discussing it, that silence does not need to be filled. At one point, toward the end of the second hour, she asked him a question I had not expected. "The quarterly reports," she said. "From Hartley, what did they contain specifically?" James considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Factual summaries," he said. "The name of the street, whether the household was stable, whether there were material difficulties that required attention, your professional situation, the sewing work as it developed. Your father's death was in one of them." A pause. "They did not tell me what you were thinking or feeling. Only the facts of your circumstances." "The subscription library," she said. "Was mentioned, yes." "The natural philosophy lecture." He met her eyes steadily. "Yes." She absorbed this. "The vicarage," she said. "The friendship with the vicar's wife was noted as a positive development in one of the later reports," he said. He stopped, and then said it anyway. "I was glad of that you had found someone." She looked at him for a moment. Her expression was something I could not name precisely. It had too many things in it, arriving in too quick a succession. What I settled on, watching it, was the expression of someone calculating the real size of something that previously had had no size at all, and finding the measurement considerably larger than anticipated. "You were glad," she said. "Yes." "For 3 years," she said quietly, "I thought of you, of the benefactor, as a kind of abstraction, a benevolent arrangement, something institutional. When I thought about it at all, which I tried not to because thinking about it produced more questions than answers. And now you are telling me that you read the reports and were glad about the vicarage." "Yes," he said. "That is personal," she said. "I know." "The abstraction," she said slowly, "was a person who was glad about the vicarage." Another pause. "That is very different from an institution." "Yes," he agreed, "it is." She looked at the table, then at the flowers in the vase. Then in the way she had of returning her attention to the thing that mattered when she had given herself sufficient time to think, back at him. "All right," she said. "Not acceptance, not forgiveness, simply, I am incorporating this. I am making room for it. We may proceed." We left at 5 o'clock. James shook her hand at the door, the formality of it right, precisely calibrated to the state of things, and she stood in the doorway and watched us to the end of the lane. In the carriage on the way back, James was quiet for a while. Then, "She will see me again." "Yes, she will." She is not what I expected." "What did you expect?" He considered. "I expected the anger to be the main event. The anger was there, but it was not the main event." A pause. "She is very clear." "In herself, I did not expect the clarity." "She has had 3 years of solitude to become clear," I said. "Solitude either breaks people or clarifies them. She is clearly not broken." "No," he said, "she is not." He came back to Ashmore 4 times before the summer ended. On the second visit, he brought a book she had mentioned, one she had been unable to find locally, sent from his own library and brought personally. This is either nothing or everything, depending on who does it and to whom, and it was everything. She received it standing in the door of the sitting room, turning it in her hands, reading the spine, looking at the title page. She looked up at him. "You remembered that?" she said. "You mentioned it precisely once," he said, "last time." At the end of the conversation, as an aside, "I expect you did not think I would recall it." "I did not," she said. "I recalled it," he said simply. She held the book for a moment, then she said, "Would you like some tea, Your Grace?" And something shifted in the room, not dramatically, not with any announcement, but shifted, the way a lamp shifts from one wick to another, and the light changes without the darkness having been any different in the interval. He stayed 2 hours that second visit, and I was not present for most of it. I manufactured a reason to walk through the town, which gave me an opportunity to look at the church, which is very fine, and the market square, and the lending library, which had a notice in the window about a lecture on botanical illustration. And all the while I thought about what was happening in a first-floor sitting room on Ashmore Lane, and whether it was going at the pace it needed to go or whether I ought to find a way to accelerate it. When James came out to meet me on the lane at the end of the 2 hours, he walked with a quality I had not seen in him in a long time. Less deliberate, lighter in the step, not conspicuously so, but enough that I noticed. "Well," I said. "She asked me about Halcroft," he said. "The estate, what it is like, whether I find the management of it satisfying or merely necessary. We talked about it for almost an hour." "And what did you tell her?" He thought about this. That the management is sometimes satisfying and sometimes merely necessary, and that the distinction depends on the season and one's general disposition on a given morning. That the park is very good. That the library is the best part of the house because the previous dukes had good taste in books and no particular instinct for renovation. He paused. "She asked about the elms." "The elms?" "Along the western wall. I had mentioned them apparently last time in passing, and she had retained it. She asked whether they were old." "Are they?" "Very old," he said. "The first duke planted them." We were quiet for a moment, walking the lane in the May afternoon. "She retained it," he said, "a detail I mentioned in passing." "Yes," I said. He said nothing more, but the quality of the silence on the drive home was different from every other silence I had received from him on the subject of Cecily Marlowe in 7 years. It was not the silence of withholding, or the silence of discipline, or the silence of a man managing something painful. It was simply the silence of someone who has no particular need to speak because what is happening is sufficient without words, and who is content, for the first time in a very long time, to be in the present moment without requiring it to be otherwise. On the second visit he brought a book she had mentioned, one she had been unable to find locally, sent from his own library and brought personally. This is either nothing or everything, depending on who does it and to whom, and it was everything. On the third visit they walked on the common for 2 hours, and I maintained a diplomatic distance of 50 yards and watched them. The even pace, the occasional stop, the way they turned to each other when something was said. On the fourth visit Cecily showed him the work table and talked about the commissions with a candor he said struck him as precise, and he had asked questions that were genuine rather than polite, and she had answered them. And something tentative became something else, something with the texture of the ordinary, of two people who find each other's company easy and are quietly surprised by this. In September she came to London. James had lunch with her at her cousin's house on a Tuesday, and then they walked in the park for 2 hours, and when he came back to dinner that evening he said, in the voice of a man who has prepared a sentence, "I intend to speak to her." "I know," I said. "What is stopping you?" "Nothing," he said, with a simplicity that told me the decision had already been made. "I have been waiting for the right moment. I believe it has arrived." "She invited you to lunch," I said. "She walked with you in the park for 2 hours. She has seen you 5 times since May. What is she telling you?" "She is telling me she is willing," he said, "that she is considering it." "Give her the actual words," I said, "not the careful version, the real ones." He did. I was not there for it. It was not a moment that required a witness. He told me the next morning at breakfast. He had asked to speak to her privately. She had taken him to the back parlor. They had sat across from each other in the afternoon light, and he had said, "I want to ask you to marry me. I know what I have done and what I have failed to do, and what the reasonable objections to this are. I am not asking you to overlook any of it. I am asking whether, in spite of all of it, the thing we have built this summer is something you would want to continue, and whether you would do me the honor of continuing it permanently." She had been quiet for a long moment. Then, why permanently? He had thought about this. "Because I have never in 10 years found a way to put you out of my mind," he said, "and I have tried on and off, and I believe by this point that the way does not exist. Permanent seems to me to be the accurate response to that." She had been quiet again. "Then, you were in Caldenmere." "Watching that corner?" "Yes." "You looked like a man who was carefully not doing something." "I was carefully not doing several things." "Was I one of them?" "You were the main one," he said. She had stood and crossed the room and held out her hand, and he had taken it, and she had said, "Yes." He told me this over breakfast with his coffee in his hand, and his expression no more changed than it ever was, except for something in the set of it, around the eyes, in the line of the mouth, that I had not seen there before. The expression of a man who has been afraid to put something down because he could not be certain it would land, and has found that it has landed and is recalibrating himself around the fact. She said yes, I said. She said yes, he confirmed. I said, I am very glad. So am I, he said, and drank his coffee. What came after the yes was, I think, the most interesting part of the whole account, more interesting, in certain ways, than the 9 years of watching, because the 9 years of watching were a single sustained thing, while what came after the yes was a series of discoveries, each slightly different in texture, and the discoveries changed both of them in ways that the single sustained thing had not been able to change them. Because change of a certain kind requires the other person to be actually present, rather than present only in a quarterly report. She came to Halcroft in the autumn, which was what James had asked, and which she had agreed to with appropriate chaperonage, in the careful and precise manner both of them brought to the management of proprieties in the period between the yes and the ceremony. The visit was a week. I arrived on the 4th day. The house had a different quality. I noticed it almost immediately upon arriving, something in the pace of the staff, the arrangement of the public rooms, a fire in the east drawing room that was not usually lit in the autumn. Halcroft Hall in the ordinary course of things was a well-run but somewhat formal house, the household of a bachelor duke who valued order and quiet, and had not given the rooms any particular reason to animate themselves beyond their basic functions. In the 4th day of Cecily's visit, it had begun to feel very slightly like a house someone lived in. I found them in the library. James was standing at the shelves near the east window, and Cecily was sitting in one of the deep chairs by the fire, and she had a book open in her lap and had apparently just said something, because he was in the attitude of a man who has just heard something worth considering and is giving it the consideration it deserves. Neither of them noticed me for a moment, and I stood in the doorway and watched them with the feeling of a man who has been waiting a long time for a particular piece of the world to arrange itself correctly, and is now in the privileged position of seeing that it has. He saw me first. Edmund, the word had a warmth in it that I noticed and did not mention. Cecily looked up. Mr. Fairley. Then, as she had begun to do by then, Edmund. She used my first name with the ease of a woman who has decided that the formality of Mr. Fairley is unnecessary for a man she has seen weep at a dinner table over a story he could not finish telling. She had learned about the weeping by then. James had told her, apparently at some point in the September visits, the full account of me at my dinner table, book open and unread, thinking about quarterly reports and lamp oil. She had received this with what James described as a long, considering silence, followed by, "He sounds," she said, "like the kind of friend one ought to have." "He is," James said. "I should like to know him properly," she said. Which was how I came to be in the library doorway on the 4th day of the Halcroft visit, being waved toward a chair by a woman I had been peripherally present in the life of for the better part of a decade, and who was now about to become the Duchess of Halcroft, and who asked me, with the direct and unsentimental curiosity I had come to associate entirely with her, to tell her what James was like when he was 19 and miserable at Kensington College. I told her. She listened with the quality of attention I had, by then, come to understand was simply how she listened, fully, without performance, without the social reflex of interjecting approval at the appropriate intervals. When I finished, she looked at James. "You were already doing it then?" she said. "Doing what?" he said. "Choosing your words very carefully," she said, "and being entirely specific about what you meant, and being more afraid of imposing than of losing things." A pause. "Yes," he said, "I expect I was." "You have always been this person," she said. It was not a judgment. It was a discovery, the discovery of a woman who has found that what she is looking at is not a recent development, not a surface produced by circumstance, but something that goes all the way down and has always gone all the way down, and the permanence of it is, unexpectedly, a relief. In November, we went back to Ashmore, the three of us, to settle the business of the rooms. Cecily had decided she would keep nothing except the books and the work table and a few pieces of sewing that were mid-commission, and needed to be completed and delivered before she left. Everything else she sold or gave away with a thoroughness that James watched with an expression I could not quite read. "You are not sorry to leave," he said at one point, watching her direct the stacking of chairs. She looked up at him. "I am grateful to leave," she said. That is different from not sorry. I am grateful for the rooms, and I am grateful for the 3 years, and I am grateful for everything they produced in me, and I am ready to be finished with them. What did they produce? He asked. She thought about this. Certainty, she said after a moment. About what I am and what I can manage and what I want. 3 years of very quiet solitude will tell you things about yourself that no amount of company can tell you. I know exactly what I think about most things and why I think it. I know what I can live without and what I found I cannot. Those are useful things to know. What did you find you cannot live without? He said. She looked at him with the directness that was entirely her. People who are entirely honest, she said, even when it is difficult, especially when it is difficult. A pause. Books, that goes without saying, and she stopped and something moved across her face, not embarrassment but a quality of precision, choosing the word that was exactly right. The possibility of understanding someone and being understood by them, properly, not approximately. He said nothing. He looked at her the way he had looked at the gray silk dress in the corner at Caldenmere, but different now, different because she was looking back at him with the same quality of attention. And this time the cart did not pass between them, and the moment did not last 3 seconds and then end. They were still in their respective positions 2 beats later, and there was between them the particular silence of 2 people who have just said, without words, something that required no improvement. The wedding was the following April, at a small church near Halcroft, with no great ceremony and no large assembly. James wanted the thing and not the performance of the thing. Cecily, who had had the performance before and found it a thin substitute, agreed without discussion. The party was small. Family, a few close friends, myself and my wife, young Palfrey from the Ashmore office, who had come at James's personal invitation and who shook the Duke's hand in the receiving line with the emotion of a man who knows he is, in some small way, part of the story. I stood at the front of the church and watched them take their places at the altar. I had seen them together a dozen times by then, at Halcroft in the autumn, in London in the winter when James had arranged several occasions that allowed them to be in the same room in perfectly respectable company, in Ashmore when we returned in November, and the 3 of us walked the common in cold, clear air, and Cecily told a story about her neighbor's dog that made James laugh in a way I had not heard from him in 20 years. The full, unguarded kind. The kind that does not have the usual preparation. My wife, who had been told the history in the way I described at the beginning, her hand in mine, the port on the table, the full account, had formed her own views about Cecily and James before she met either of them. She had met them together at Halcroft in January and had come away saying very little for 2 hours, which was unusual for my wife, who is in general not a woman who comes away from anything saying very little for 2 hours. When I asked her what she thought, she said, "He has been waiting for a long time." "Yes," I said. "And she has been becoming herself for a long time." "Yes." "They are," she said, "very well matched." And then, after a pause, "I think the 10 years may have been necessary." I did not agree with this at the time. I had spent considerable energy over 7 of those 10 years being impatient with James's inability to move, and the idea that the inability had been in some sense correct, that the 10 years were what they needed to be, struck me as the kind of comfortable retrospection that forgives what it should have criticized. I said so. My wife looked at me with the patience she brings to my more obstinate positions. "I don't mean it forgives the silence," she said. "I mean that she needed to know herself the way she knows herself now, and that required the 3 years in Ashmore, and the 3 years in Ashmore required the marriage, and the marriage required his not being there to complicate things. I am not saying the 10 years were good. I am saying they produced something in her that she would not have had otherwise. She would not have been the same person if things had been easier. I thought about this for a long time. I think about it still. I am not sure my wife is right, but I am not sure she is wrong either, and I have come to believe that this is one of those questions about which certainty of any kind is suspect. The church at Halcroft was small and cold and April bright. The light came through the plain windows in the particular way of an English spring morning, thin and clear and full of promise that might or might not be kept. There were perhaps 40 people present. The estate's closest families, a few of James's friends from London, Cecily's cousin from the Marlowe side and her husband, the vicar's wife from Ashmore who had come 60 miles because Cecily had asked her, and she was the kind of person who comes 60 miles because you ask her to and makes no particular remark about it. Young Palfrey was there, standing near the back with his wife, in a new coat that I noticed was very fine. He had been the instrument of the whole thing in ways he would never fully appreciate: the careful anonymity, the quarterly payments, the strongbox rescued from the fire, the letter that had finally brought James to Ashmore. He was 26 and new to his own marriage, and I expect he found the occasion moving in the way of a young man who has not yet had the experience of seeing how things end, and who finds the ending of things unexpectedly beautiful. James stood at the altar in a charcoal coat, composed, upright, his hands still at his sides in the manner I had known for 30 years. He was waiting. He had been waiting for 10 years in the various forms the waiting had taken, and now there was very little waiting left, and the knowledge of it was in his face in a way that I thought probably only I could see. A slight increase in the quality of stillness, a gravity with something warm underneath it, like a stone that has been in the sun. Cecily came down the aisle on the arm of her cousin's husband, who was the closest available relation, and who performed the duty with a simple dignity she had requested in advance. She was in a pale dress, cream and ivory, something understated, which was exactly her, and she walked at her own pace, which was not the pace of nerves or performance, but the pace of a woman who has decided to be in each moment of the morning in the order it arrives, without rushing any of it. She reached the altar, she looked at James. James said, "I do." He said it as he said everything, quietly, precisely, with the weight of complete intention behind it. Cecily said it back. And when she turned to look at him, fully, without reserve, the way I had not seen her look at anything in all the months I had known her, her face had the expression I described at the beginning, the one that made me weep at the back of that small church while my wife held my hand and did not laugh. It was the expression of a woman who has been wrong about something large for a very long time and has discovered that she was wrong, and the discovery is brighter than she expected, more unheld. Warmer and simpler, and so deeply relieving that it comes through every composure she has built and stands on her face, plain and visible and entirely unmanaged. She had thought herself forgotten. She had not been forgotten, not for a single day. I have thought in the 6 years since about what this story is a story of. It is easy to say it is a love story, and it is a love story certainly. But I think it is more specifically the story of two kinds of faithfulness, his and hers, and how they survived a decade without finding each other, and what it cost them both, and why that cost, paid in full, turns out to matter. I have also thought about what the story is not. It is not a story about the triumph of feeling over circumstance, or about love conquering every obstacle. The obstacles in this case were largely internal, largely produced by James himself, and were overcome not by any great romantic gesture, but by a fire in an archive and a clerk with a strongbox, and the accumulated weight of a decade making it finally impossible to continue. It is not a story about two people who were destined for each other in some fashionable sense that suggests the universe was arranging things on their behalf. The universe was not arranging anything. The universe was entirely indifferent and various things happened, and James was constitutionally unable to stop caring, and Cecily was constitutionally unable to become less than herself. And those two facts, pressed together by circumstance over 10 years, eventually produced something. That is not the same as destiny, but I have come to think it is something better than destiny. It is character, expressed under pressure for a long time until it becomes undeniable. His faithfulness was the faithfulness of a man who could not speak and would not disappear. He could not walk away from Cecily Marlowe any more than he could walk away from Halcroft. She was a fact of him, something he was made of that could not be unmade. And because he could not speak and could not walk away, he expressed it in the only form left to him. Practical, anonymous, invisible, the faithfulness of a man who fills the lamp with oil and mends the gate and makes sure the roof does not leak, not because he has been asked to, but because the place he is tending matters to him and always has. It was wrong of him to keep the secret. He admitted it and meant the admission. But the faithfulness underneath the secret was real and sustained, and that is not nothing. Her faithfulness was of a different and in some ways harder kind. It was the faithfulness of a woman who had no particular reason to believe in anything and kept her own standards anyway. The small room above the lane, the neat bookcase, the precise handwriting. The willingness, when the conversation in May finally happened, to receive a large and surprising truth without either collapsing or refusing it, to hold it steadily and examine it, and eventually with the patience she brought to everything to understand it. She had not known she was being watched over. She had believed herself forgotten and had not allowed herself to become small. That is also faithfulness, though it is faithfulness to oneself rather than to another, and I think it is the harder practice. Between the two faithfulnesses there was a decade of separation, and a fire, and a box of letters, and a conversation over tea in a room with spring flowers on the table. That is all there was, but it turned out to be sufficient. I want to say one thing more, before I get to the last scene I have of them, which is the image I return to most often. Cecily asked me once, this was in the first year of the marriage, in the library at Halcroft where I had found them before and where I found them frequently after, whether I had known, at Caldenmere, what James was feeling, whether I had seen it from the start. I told her the truth. I had seen something. I had not known exactly what it was until I watched him watch the empty corner for 20 minutes after she left. That was when I knew. She was quiet for a moment. Then, was he very unhappy? I considered the question. He was contained, I said. He is always contained, but yes, in the years after your marriage particularly. He was very unhappy in a way that was entirely quiet and entirely managed and entirely present if you knew where to look. I paused. He chose it. I want you to understand that. He was not simply suffering passively. He could have chosen differently at any point. He chose not to impose himself, and he chose to keep the watch, and he chose the particular shape the care took, and every one of those choices was freely made. It was not tragic helplessness. It was, I found the word, devotion. In the original sense, a dedication of oneself to something without expectation of return. She looked at the fire for a long time. Then she said, I am going to try to be worth it. You already are, I said. I know that, she said. But I am going to try anyway. The last time I visited them was in the autumn of the second year of the marriage, when I came to Halcroft for a week in October. The park had gone gold, and the sky was the wide gray of English autumn, and everything had the clear, slightly melancholy beauty of things at their ending and their beginning simultaneously. I came down from the library in the late afternoon and saw them from the upper window on the west side, James and Cecily, walking the path along the wall where the elms stand in a row. The same path James and I had walked on the November day he first told me about Hartley, and the letters, and the 4 years of watching that had preceded the 6 years of providing. They were walking slowly. James, who had always walked with a purpose and a pace that implied he had somewhere specific to be, was walking slowly. Cecily was talking. He was listening with that complete and still attention he gave to things that mattered, and their heads were close together in the way that happens, without planning, when two people have decided they do not need to maintain any particular distance, and the October light was on both of them, and the elms were moving in the cold wind above the wall. I stood at the window for a long time and watched them walk, and I thought, 10 years, and now they are walking slowly. That is what it looks like, not the claiming before a crowd, not the public declaration in a ballroom. The walking slowly, in the October afternoon, on a path they have both decided to walk together. It took them 10 years to find the right pace. I believe it is exactly the pace they needed. For 7 years she thought he had forgotten her. She never knew he was the one keeping her alive. She knows now, and if the knowledge arrived later than it should have, and by a route more complicated than anyone would have designed, a fire, and a solicitor's strongbox, and a conversation about a charitable trust that became, in the space of an afternoon, the most honest conversation either of them had ever had, the knowledge arrived. That is the thing. The arrival is the thing. I was Edmund Fairley, the Duke of Halcroft's nearest friend, and I was there for the whole of it, and I count it among the privileges of my life to have been present. He was a careful man and a silent one, and he loved her every day for 10 years in complete silence and at considerable cost to himself, and she was a patient woman and a clear-eyed one, and she survived the 10 years intact and herself and ready when the moment finally came to receive the truth of it. The truth of it was this: he had been watching the corner. Her corner in every room she inhabited for 10 years, from the safe distance that was all he knew how to maintain, and it had been, in its imperfect and oblique and finally impossible to sustain way, the longest and most faithful act of love I have ever witnessed. She calls him James. She has called him that from the morning of the wedding, with the ease of a woman who has decided that 10 years of waiting is more than long enough to justify the dispensing of formality. He calls her Cecily, in the voice he calls everything, quiet and precise and entirely meant. They walk slowly in the October afternoons. That is what it looks like when something has had the time it needed. That is the whole of it.